Welcome to the Point. In the next few weeks, we will continue to introduce you to new members of the State House that will be representing you in Lansing starting next year. But those are not the only new representatives in our area. All U.S. representatives from our viewing area won re-election, with the exception of Justin Amash, who chose not to run for re-election. Republican Peter Meijer won in a crowded primary and was successful in November. That means next month he'll head to Washington to deal with a polarized Congress while representing the voters in Calhoun, Berry, Ionia, and Kent counties. Recently, I talked with the congressman-elect about his campaign, his election victory, and what he will focus on as a member of Congress. I'll start by congratulating you on your win, and it seems like a lifetime away as we're talking now, but as you prepare to go to Washington and be sworn in, give me your take looking back over this election cycle of how that went. I mean, all of the complications of a pandemic and a pretty tough fought race.
Yeah, thank you, Rick, and grateful to be on. Obviously, 2020 was a year that none of us expected. Certainly when we launched our campaign in July of 2019, it was the furthest thing from our minds that this is what we'd have to be dealing with. But my background is in the military and humanitarian aid. I'm used to getting thrown into unpredictable situations and trying to figure a way out. And so I'm really proud of our team. I'm proud of the support we gained from the community. I'm grateful that when COVID struck, we were able to help out and deliver, close to 37,000 meals to folks throughout West Michigan so they could stay home and stay safe in those, first couple of weeks and months when we were trying to get a grasp on things. Now, 15 months after we launched our campaign and we're successful in November, and just a month after that, we're focused on building our office. We're focused on making sure that we're hitting the ground running, and that we can be as impactful for the community and well represent West Michigan in Washington, D.C.
What does that look like from your perspective? Obviously, you had not run for public office before. As you say, you have been in circumstances where you have been in service, certainly for the country and doing humanitarian aid. But what does it look like when you try to build the infrastructure for a congressional office, having never done that at any level, from a political level before?
Well, I'm fortunate to have a lot of mentors. I say I've never been in the belly of the beast when it comes to elected office, but I've spent a lot of time on various parts of the rim looking down in. I've done education advocacy, including campaigning for legislation, offering input, and testifying before Congress on veteran education issues. I'd spent time dealing with the consequences of policy when I was working in Afghanistan and also when I was a soldier in Iraq. So I've had a lot of time in adjacent areas. I look forward to bringing those experiences to bear, but I'm also very cognizant of the things that I may not know. We've started to put together a fantastic team, balancing out folks who have legislative experience with folks who know the district, with folks who understand where we are today and where we need to go. And I'm also blessed to have a number of mentors who are on Capitol Hill right now, folks I look up to who have offered, a hand in giving advice and allowing us to kind of bounce ideas off of them to make sure that we are, learning from past experiences so that we can be a step ahead.
I want to talk a little bit about the district, and I want to get to your priorities too, but this is a diverse district. And so as you go from one end to the other, it's also geographically pretty good size. How do you stay in touch with those constituents? Because I know that you talked about during the election cycle, of course, you'll want to be in touch with people who supported you and people who didn't support you, because you've got to represent everybody in that area. How do you do that? What are your plans on keeping in touch with voters?
Yeah, we're planning to set up a number of community councils so that we're able to focus on not only what folks in various interest groups, various parts of the community, various elements of our geographic district, not only what issues they might be having and allowing a more rapid mechanism for them to reach out to us, but also so that when we have legislation that's going before us that may impact those communities, we can operate that as a sounding board. So it's not just being in a reactive mindset, but also going forward, soliciting opinions and making sure we're representing the whole of the district. We're actually pretty fortunate here in West Michigan in the 3rd District. It's about 2 hours at the most from the northwest southwest corner to the southeast. So we're in a much better position than some of my colleagues who have districts that, takes them 12 or 14 hours to drive across. So we're looking forward to, staying in constant contact. And to be honest, a lot of the ability of folks to adapt to, what we're doing right now, communicating on Zoom. It will cut out some travel time, and especially in these early days of our term in office when we're having to deal with social distancing and COVID precautions, I look forward to being able to use that outreach to make sure that we're staying in more constant contact, even when we might be in DC for votes. That ability to reach back and have immediate feedback from the district will be invaluable.
We have all adapted to different ways of communication, and I'm sure that will be the same for all 435 members of Congress because of the necessity of it. When you were campaigning, and I know so much, particularly in the second half of the campaign, COVID was so much a focus, and necessarily so, and that will remain. But as you were talking to voters, as you were hearing from people from all of the different counties, was there something that stood out to you that people were interested in above other issues? And again, I understand that COVID was a constant there, but was there a theme that you felt like that you were hearing when you got feedback?
I think just frustration with the status quo, and that could manifest itself in folks saying we need more bipartisanship. There are serious issues that we're facing, and we're not seeing any action being done, to what I call the bread and butter issues, where we've seen cost of living increases being driven by healthcare, housing, and education costs skyrocketing. And again, I try to take a very long-term approach. I try to take an outcome-oriented view. The first question I ask isn't what can the federal government do to solve this problem? It's what is the federal government currently doing that's lacking or that's making the problem worse? Because we need to understand that before we try to just layer on more solutions that could only complicate, an ultimate positive outcome. But, it's really just a fact that they feel that the discussion going on in Washington, D.C. is all too often driven by rapid news cycles and whatever the outrage of the day is, rather than focusing on things that really matter in the long term. And that was something that I've talked about from the very beginning. It's something that motivated me to get into office, or to run for office, and now motivates me while I'm in office, is how do we make sure that we continue to have upward social mobility, that folks still have economic and educational opportunities, and that rather than trying to subsidize on the back end, we make sure that on the front end, the opportunities, the quality, the services being provided are the very best that they can, and driving towards never being content with something that might just be working okay, but realizing in this country, our citizens deserve the best.
When you talk about bipartisanship, that was the first thing you mentioned, that people said they'd like to see more bipartisanship. That seems like an easy thing to do, but it almost has become the third rail of American politics, because to compromise can sometimes be very damaging for one's base. And I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat, when you're compromising with the other party, there are some within your party that will say that you're cooperating with the enemy. How do you battle that kind of polarization that is very real right now?
Yeah, I think everyone loves the idea of bipartisanship. It's when that actually gets put into practice that one side will say you went too far and the other will say you didn't go far enough. To me, it's about picking your battles, and it's about focusing on areas where there is a realistic possibility of forward action. One of the really fun parts of our freshman orientation, now we were masked up and it was distanced, and so we didn't have the opportunity to necessarily bond as I think prior classes have had. But a number of folks, Democrats and Republicans, came up to me and were like, hey, we saw during your campaign you were talking a lot about ending wars overseas. We'd love to talk more. Okay. Others would say we love the fact that you were focusing a lot on environmental protection. That's also a priority in our district. We'd love to jointly sponsor something. So I think there are areas that there are real opportunities for bipartisanship. Again, it's not going to be everywhere. I don't think anyone should be under any illusions that a lot of the hot button issues where parties are on diametrically opposed sides, that's not a good place to kind of throw in the middle and try to stake a reputation early on. But that having been said, I think there are a tremendous amount of opportunities where it's less of a polarized issue and where it really impacts the country on the whole in the long term, and where neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party are monoliths. There's a variety of opinions on both sides of the aisle, and I'm excited for the opportunity to work with colleagues who we may differ on any number of issues, but on whatever issue we're focusing on, we can come to some agreement and try to move the ball forward.
When we come back, we'll talk about what the newest congressman from Michigan will focus on in D.C. That's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Next month, 435 members of Congress will be seated in the nation's capital. Democrats are in the majority despite pickups from Republicans in the November election. For the first time in a decade, the 3rd Congressional District will have new representation. Peter Meijer won that seat that had been held by Justin Amash, who did not run for re-election. We talked with the Congressman-elect about how he'll approach his new job and what his priorities are as he heads to Washington. Let's talk about some of the specifics, particularly when it comes to what you called upward mobility and trying to battle some of the problems that exist with the cost of housing and a number of costs that hold people back, including health care that you mentioned as well. How do you combat that? Because at a moment when the economy has certainly hit a pause over the past few months, we still see glimmers that it could be rebounding, and as it does, those costs still remain out there. I mean, housing in particular has been going up and up and up, and when you look in the core of some of the bigger cities in your district, finding affordable housing can be a real challenge for folks, particularly who maybe are just starting out in a career and their incomes aren't quite matching what the cost is for housing. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so housing is something I love to talk about, and I wish we had 2 hours and we could go down a rabbit hole of some innovative ways that we can be better educating building inspectors so that they're not just approving what they already know, but have the flexibility to incorporate new and proven technologies that can lower that ultimate end cost. We see in housing projects that anything from or roughly 30% of the overall cost gets eaten up by what are called impact fees. Right? Every new requirement that the government layers on, every new hurdle that has to be met, many of those are very well intentioned, but the process can create uncertainty, which then raises the cost, which then is ultimately paid for by whoever is moving in there down the line. I'm very frustrated at the way that younger generations are being locked out of the housing market because of a lot of protectionist policies that we have. Now, again, the federal government is perhaps not the optimal source to solve every one of these issues, but where we can offer the right incentives to make sure that we are taking advantage of improvements in processes and improvements in technology. So much of the way that we build buildings today is essentially the same as we built them 100 years ago. And 100 years ago, we had cheap labor and cheap materials, and today we have neither. So we need to be adapting to the realities today. We need to realize that for folks to feel, for the younger generation to feel financially secure, for them to be able to build towards retirement and feel a sense of the ability to commit to a geography and to a career, we can't have them continuously be housing insecure because of high rent.
Do you think, and as you point out, that may not all be the function of the federal government because some of the things, inspections and those kind of things are more localized, but they are driven by some policies at the federal level. Do you think that you can have that kind of an impact by working not just from your position in Washington, but working with locals as well? Because when you talk about the younger generation, when you talk about people who are just starting out particularly, the frustration is real, and you hear it and you see it when people are not able to find the kind of housing they want. And you hear it from even in Grand Rapids. You hear city leaders talk about it a lot, that there isn't that affordable housing. Can that be a collaborative effort between local and state and federal partners?
I think that collaboration is exactly where we should go for. And when I mean collaboration, it's not necessarily, it could be, but not necessarily revenue sharing programs or something where there's strings attached or entitlements. But it could be as simple as talking to officials and saying, okay, where are you running up against a wall where you see an opportunity, but you're hampered by the current regulations that, again, may have been well intended, but if they are preventing innovation, if they're preventing you from trying new policies, then that is overall stifling market-based competition. And that's what at the end of the day is going to drive costs low. The government can play some role in shaping around the edges, but as we've seen in just about every industry, there's a strong and almost one-to-one correlation between government funding and costs rising. And to me, that's not a coincidence. The more the government will subsidize the sector, the more the sector will ultimately adjust, and the folks who are without that subsidy will end up paying more. Housing is a great example where, again, but I could talk about any number of them, where you want to have all of those stakeholders in the room. You want to have the folks from HUD who may be involved in various waiver or subsidy components of our current affordable housing system to make sure that their approach is narrowly tailored so it isn't inadvertently rising costs who fall just beyond their mandate. That's what we often see in housing is if you qualify at whatever percentile of average median income, if you fall within that and you qualify, it's very positive and there are opportunities that are available. If you're just outside of that, those are the folks who end up getting the most squeezed because of some of those distortions in the market. So I think it needs to be a thoughtful approach focused on the long term, but you need to ultimately have all relevant parties in the room. And that's one of my goals is to really make sure that that communication is constant and that, you're taking into account what the incentive of any one organization or institution might be, but never forgetting, what ultimately needs to be done for the American people in the long term.
If COVID-19 has done anything, and it has done many things, but if it has done anything, it certainly, has put a focus on the need for accessibility to affordable health care. And kind of the thing that has happened, one of the things that has happened during this pandemic is that when people are impacted because of closures of business, because their particular industry can't stay open, they are separated not just from their job, but from their health care at a time when they may need it most. That is very much on the federal radar. That has been a federal issue for a very long time. Yeah. How do you approach that?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to the early 90s when that was a strong first-term Clinton administration initiative, right? This has been something that's been bedeviled politicians, and it's easy to offer some trite sound bites on, but our healthcare industry is massive. There's a lot of things they do exceptionally well. Look at the fact that the first COVID vaccines were developed within 72 hours. I think Moderna shipped their first one to the FDA for review in the third week of February. I mean, that's incredible. We see now everything that's happened since then has been testing, and that is positive and that is necessary to make sure that it's safe. But we also need to appreciate how much of the cost in our healthcare system is driven by regulations. Again, I am very mindful of the fact that not only are most regulations well-intended, but some regulations are definitely necessary, and we need to be very mindful and not just take a broad brush approach. But we should be looking for every opportunity to make that as efficient as possible. You look at how many folks are dying every day in the U.S. from COVID, and the fact that we're still, the UK has already distributed and started vaccinating folks. Every day that passes are missed opportunities. And I think it's frustrating that at the federal level, there hasn't been that sense of urgency to address and make sure we have a long-term sustainable healthcare system. Now, on the other point about how the COVID pandemic has impacted our healthcare system, I think it's very important to note healthcare has been one of the slowest fields to digitize and to take advantage of technological improvements. Apart from pharmaceutical manufacturer, medical device manufacturer, the overall healthcare system has remained largely unchanged for upwards of 50 years. Right now, what we're seeing is a strong acceleration towards telemedicine and telehealth. The more we have smaller, more affordable devices, what that does is it breaks down barriers of access. I've talked with folks in the mental health community about this as well. For some folks who may not have access to a car regularly, who may have to rely on public transportation, who have to take time off or schedule around their job because they don't have flexibility, perhaps during the lunch hour, to seek scheduled medical care. Being able to be where you are and take advantage, at least getting that initial, that initial kind of checkup, being able to have a device that can take those vital signs. What that does is that just it increases access. It allows that folks aren't waiting until the last minute, until it's absolutely urgent, but you can place a greater priority on preventative care. And I think that'll ultimately be a strong factor in improving outcomes and lowering costs as well. That's going to be a component, and we need to make sure that the current regulatory and environment is not getting in the way of innovations in the telemedicine space and in many others. But again, that's where you need to be in constant communication, because the last thing you want to do is to have the technology get ahead of the application. You don't want that to be lagging, you don't want it to be leading, but you want to make sure that the two are operating hand in hand.
I have talked to members of Congress for the better part of 40 years, and that conversation has always included this. Government spending is something that the party not in power always decries. When the Republicans are in charge, the Democrats complain about Republican spending. When the Democrats are in charge, Republicans complain about Democrat spending. But under anybody, the spending continues to go up, and there doesn't seem to be any urgency about paying the tab. What does Congress need to be doing to take a long look so your kids and grandkids and their kids aren't paying the bill for spending that we've been doing for the last 30 years?
I think it starts with having more folks in Congress who are going to be paying that bill. One of the challenges we have right now is it's really easy to write a check that somebody else is going to have to cash. You're right. There's been a bipartisan bias towards ever increasing deficits. The last time we had a serious talk about budget and deficit control, it resulted in the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and they put out a report, and it had a lot of very tough, recommendations, and it was shelved and never really spoken of again. And that was back in the first term of the Obama administration. We look at where our federal debt is right now. Public debt to GDP is encroaching on $30 trillion before too long. I think by the time COVID's said and done, and I can remember, it was only a few short years ago, we were just below 20. COVID has made every problem, every challenge that we have, it has made it exponentially more challenging and or just pushed it down the road. And this is not a place where time is on our side. So I think there are a number of long-term issues that are driving it. And it's not just, the spending that Congress is voting on every year. You could cut the entire budget of the Department of Defense, and sell every asset that we have, and you still wouldn't be able to balance the budget. We need to be focusing on long-term solutions. We need to be focusing on being realistic about what we're looking at, because a lot of the projections right now are taking into account assuming a constant interest rate environment that may not be the case. And that, when we look at how our debt to GDP is in the U.S. compared to abroad, that has to factor in on our trade deficits and just on our currency valuations. There's a number of areas that are kind of come into this, but it's something we have to be disciplined towards. And I think that starts with having folks in the room who are in the younger generation that's ultimately going to be saddled with all the debt for the expenses that Congress is currently putting down the line.
Just a few seconds left, and I know that obviously the pandemic is going to occupy a lot of your time. When time permits, what's your first priority? What's the first thing you want to work on when you get to Washington?
And you're absolutely right. Pandemic's going to do. We'll see if there's a COVID package that comes out. If we don't have a satisfactory resolution, that's absolutely a priority in terms of bipartisan alignment, working to end our wars overseas. Repealing the post 9/11 Iraq War authorizations for the use of military force and putting a sunset clause on any additional authorizations for the use of military force, so we get out of these forever wars and are focused on long-term threats rather than just the inertia that's been driving our foreign policy.
No matter what else, the new Congress will have to deal with responding to the ongoing pandemic and trying to jumpstart the economy. Those will be front burner issues, but there will no doubt be other weighty matters that Congress will have to deal with. And as always, we'll keep in contact with our congressional delegation to help keep you informed. When we come back, a final thought. To the point. In the next 3 weeks, we'll introduce you to 4 new members of the State House. If you missed last week when we interviewed 2 more new members, you can find that show at woodtv.com. Next week, Governor Gretchen Whitmer will join us to talk about a year full of heartbreak and uncertainty and what she expects for 2021. I hope you'll join us then and every week as we look over the political landscape right here. To the point.